This year is a key moment for meaningful progress on U.S. anti-corruption and anti-money laundering reforms. As a reminder, the U.S. has the unfortunate distinction of being the #1 financial secrecy jurisdiction, according to the Financial Secrecy Index, and perhaps the easiest place to hide dirty money, according to Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. In 2021, the FACT Coalition and our allies were pleased to see an ambitious whole-of-government strategy to counter corruption, launched with a big focus on corruption at the first Summit for Democracy at the end of that year. We have also been heartened by many aspects of the US and G7 efforts to hunt down Russian oligarch assets in the West following the invasion of Ukraine. But more than 2 years into the Biden administration, we fear momentum for important structural reforms is stalling. It's time to close the growing gap between rhetoric and action. To take one example, we are now deeply concerned regarding the implementation of the landmark Corporate Transparency Act. The latest proposed rule has drawn fire from many quarters, including from the FACT Coalition. As most of you know, this law requires the establishment of the first ever US registry of the true beneficial owners of anonymous shell companies often used to facilitate crimes. Important changes must be included in the final rule based on the clear, plain language of the Corporate Transparency Act. These include removing and revising problematic hurdles complicating directory use by US state, local, and tribal authorities, including removing the unfounded requirement that relevant authorities obtain a quote-unquote court order to access the directory. FinCEN must also clarify that FinCEN and other authorities should not be assuming a substantive legal and administrative roles in approving directory access on a case-by-case basis. This is simply not contemplated by the statute. The final rule needs to ensure that information submitted to the directory conforms with data best practices and is validated and verified. The final rule must also allow financial institutions to access beneficial ownership information pursuant to their broader anti-money laundering and sanction screening responsibilities, rather than restricting authorization criteria to a narrow subset of customer due diligence activities. Finally, and importantly, the final rule should remove burdensome restrictions which lack statutory basis on our trusted foreign partners who access this information. This is important for pursuing transnational financial crimes investigations. As another indicator of lagging progress, we are also concerned that an important financial crime fighting agency, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, is still under-resourced and without a permanent director 2 years into the Biden administration. US leadership on anti-corruption will be under the spotlight this year, with the second Summit for Democracy happening at the end of this month. The US is also hosting the Conference of State Parties for the UN Convention Against Corruption in December, and our partners need to see the US as a credible leader through its actions at home. Today, we have a great lineup of experts here to answer your questions. We'll start with a quick round of opening remarks and then turn to you all for questions. Please use the Q&A function on the Zoom platform. First, I'll turn to Elise Bean, former staff director and chief counsel, the US Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, to expand on our concerns about the implementation of the Corporate Transparency Act. Over to you, Elise.
Thanks, Ian. I will be talking about the Corporate Transparency Act, which is a key anti-corruption law that was enacted in January of 2021. It was designed to stop wrongdoing by companies with hidden owners. This year, 2023, is going to be key to its implementation. As Ian suggested, the Biden administration got off to a strong start on implementing this law, but it has since stumbled. In essence, the Corporate Transparency Act requires legal entities formed or registered to do business in the United States to file a disclosure form with FinCEN disclosing the human beings that own or control them, what is called the beneficial owners. The first regulation that the Biden administration issued was pretty good. They talked about who's covered by the law and the kinds of information they have to disclose. But then in January, they released a proposed disclosure form, the actual form that will be filed by people in the registry, and it's a disaster. It does ask for the 4 key pieces of information that is made mandatory in the Corporate Transparency Act. For each beneficial owner, you have to give their name, their address, birth date, an identifying number from a driver's license or passport. So that's in there. But the form then provides for each piece of information an option to say unknown. You can just check this box unknown and not provide the information. There's no guidance or standard given for when you can check that box. And if you think about it, it really guts the entire law. When we asked financial institutions to know their customers, provide KYC information, we didn't say, oh, you can also tell us that it's unknown. It was required by the law and banks complied. Under the Corporate Transparency Act, companies are required to know who their owners are, KYO information, and they shouldn't be given an option to simply say unknown. So the bottom line is we need to get rid of that option from the proposed disclosure form. A second issue I want to talk about is the proposed rule on access, who can actually see the information in the beneficial ownership registry. It has a lot of good provisions in it. It provides a relatively uncomplicated access for federal agencies and for non-US law enforcement agencies. Essentially what it says is that they can certify in writing that they meet the requirements of the law. And once they provide that certification, they're given immediate access to the data in the registry. Afterwards, FinCEN and others can audit the procedures to see if there were any instances of improper access. But for state and local law enforcement offices, which provide, it's estimated 90% of the actual law enforcement activities in the country, they don't have that same access. Instead, they impose, the proposed rule has a proposed double approval process that's nowhere in the law. They require them first to get court orders. That implies judges have to be involved, even though the law is very clear that judges should not have to be involved. And then they require FinCEN to review that court order for sufficiency. It's not clear what is meant by that, and under what circumstances FinCEN could overrule both a law enforcement agency and a court and say, no, you can't have access to the registry at all. So that goes way beyond what the law entails, and the proposed rule needs to be changed to provide better access to state and local law enforcement along the same lines as is provided for federal agencies. I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great, thanks, Elise. And I'm sure there'll be questions on the process there. We'll turn now to Lakshmi Kumar, who's the policy director at Global Financial Integrity. Lakshmi will make some remarks around another issue that's hugely important, which is money laundering in the real estate sector in the US. Lakshmi.
Thank you, Ian. In 2020, GFI produced a report which essentially identified that the real estate sector at a minimum had about $2.5 billion laundering its rates. So we really saw that about 40 million per case was being laundered through real estate. The result of this work was that later that year, when the White House put out a strategy on how to counter corruption, real estate was at the forefront as an issue that needed to be addressed. Since then, while we have received an advance notice around rulemaking in the sector, there has been little movement on actually creating a robust anti-money laundering rule. And this is concerning for several reasons. When we look at the US real estate market, what is particularly shocking is that nearly 80% of the money that we found being laundered in the market was coming from outside the US. It could be traced to over 26 different countries. And the vast majority, over 50% of this money was coming as a result of from politically exposed persons that were either accused or implicated in corruption scandals. Now, the US remains the only country within the G7 to enact no nationwide rule that is applicable and targets real estate money laundering. Now, while the GTOs that have been in effect for a number of years have served an important and no doubt valuable purpose as an information collection exercise. They've also exposed the vast loopholes in the system, and that selectively targeting geographies within the US is no clear-cut solution to addressing the problem that is nationwide. Our own efforts have revealed that the vast majority of real estate money laundering cases occur outside the GTO locations, and the manner in which the GTOs themselves are structured really point to clear and easy pathways to get around it. Above all, the rule on real estate money laundering ties itself into a larger discussion on the ways through which individuals, corrupt political elites, and organized crime launder money in the US. In all cases, it occurs, and it is necessary to act through an actor to make those purchases. So it doesn't occur in a vacuum. In all cases, there's a requirement to have a real estate agent, a lawyer, another type of functionary that can facilitate those purchases. If we're creating a robust rule that ensures that there is, at least at every level, one individual that is involved in the process that is required to provide disclosure on who the beneficial owner is, where they are sourcing their money from, and how that money is making its way into the US, is critical to establishing a strong and vital mechanism to target real estate money laundering in the sector. But I'm always happy to answer any further questions, but I will hand it back to Ian with that.
Thanks, Lakshmi. And when do we think we might see a draft regulation to deal with real estate? I
mean, we've heard that there is a possibility we might see it either in the first or the second quarter, but I think it is vital that the sooner we get regulation on board, the better. We have had a FinCEN temporary exemption for real estate agents that has lasted more than 2 decades. And so I think we've had enough time to try and figure out how to navigate this space.
Great, thanks so much. I'll turn now to Gary Kalman. Gary is the Executive Director of Transparency International U.S. Gary.
Thanks, Ian, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk about 2 important reforms that are at the top of the agenda for anti-money laundering activists and the countering illicit finance. The first is the Enablers Act. My colleagues have talked about anti-money laundering and customer due diligence. Lakshmi just talked about in the real estate sector. Others are going to talk about investment advisors. Banks already have these responsibilities. But we found through a mountain of evidence that has accumulated over the years that there are loopholes in our law. There are actors who are bringing money into the system that do not have these kinds of responsibilities. And let me take a step back. When we talk about customer due diligence, as Lakshmi suggested, there's 2 major aspects to it. One is, who is the person that is behind the company or the investment? The second is, are they somebody that we should be doing business with? And so if Vladimir Putin walks into a bank and has a passport, yes, that's the Corporate Transparency Act. We know who he is, but there's clearly the source of funds, and is he on sanctions list, et cetera, et cetera. That's the thing that we need these additional gatekeepers to the financial system to be looking at. That's what the Enablers Act does. It looks at trust formation agents. It would include corporate formation agents. It would include those who manage and move money in and out of the US financial system. That bill, these kinds of reforms, let me say, often take many, many years. The Corporate Transparency Act took 12 years to pass. Last year, the Enablers Act was introduced and came very close to being included in the National Defense Authorization Act, the bill that funds our military, and fell just short. But the bipartisan support we saw, the bipartisan coalition that had rallied around the Enablers Act, we are continuing as part of the coalition and with all the groups on this call and others to find a pathway forward to see if we can't get that those important reforms enacted. The second thing I want to briefly touch on is after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the US set up the Klepto Capture Task Force to look at and identify where the oligarch money is hidden in the United States. We then joined an international network called the Repo Task Force, the Russian elites, proxies, and other oligarchs, which is made up, a task force which is made up of G7 countries and a couple of others. And it's had remarkable results. A press release was just issued earlier this month saying that they have frozen or seized or blocked $58 billion worth of sanctioned assets. They have frozen money and immobilized billions more from the Russian central bank. They've seized yachts and real estate. They've held a number of meetings. They've coordinated on a number of international investigations. All of this is really fascinating and important because in the past, it took years, months or years to move information between jurisdictions. And now we're finding that it's done quite quickly. Are there lessons we can learn? And we want to take those lessons and make sure that we implement those globally and beyond this immediate crisis to counter the threats that are coming from more countries than just Russia. So let me stop there, but those are two key things we hope to see in the near future.
Thanks, Gary. I'll turn now to Erica Hanichak. Erica is the Government Affairs Director at the FACT Coalition. And Erica, you can speak to some of the issues related to resourcing our financial crimes fighting agencies and the context for support for anti-corruption and anti-money laundering reforms in Congress.
Thank you, Ian, and thanks everyone for being here. It's clear that countering corruption and financial crime is the issue of our time. The administration has set its strategy. Congress, in a bipartisan way, is interested in this cause, as is represented by the Caucus Against Foreign Corruption and Kleptocracy. And it's even eked into the public consciousness through exposés like the Pandora Papers. There's scarcely another issue that I can think of that underlies the major problems that we're facing today, whether that be in our foreign policy, our national security, human trafficking, fentanyl trafficking, or even the housing crisis. And when we counter financial crime and strengthen U.S. anti-money laundering safeguards, we are protecting our national security and defending global democracy. So let me just talk about two examples that, particularly as we think about the position of anti-money laundering rules vis-a-vis Congress, are incredibly relevant and should drive forward the momentum on these issues. For instance, with China, it's no secret that Chinese Communist Party officials and criminals have flocked to the United States and other rule of law jurisdictions to park their ill-gotten gains. These kleptocrats spin the proverbial wheel of fortune to pick the U.S. asset class or U.S. enabler that may best help them obscure their money, whether that be putting money into trusts, private investment, which Zoe will speak to, or real estate, or whether they're working with lawyers, accountants, or corporate and trust service providers. Though the U.S. House Select Committee on China held its first hearing last week, it only very lightly touched on updating our anti-money laundering rules as a way to bolster U.S. security vis-a-vis China. If Congress cares about tackling Chinese corporate espionage, fentanyl trafficking, and other dangers, it must prioritize reforms to keep those toxic funds from poisoning our financial system. Likewise with Ukraine. Last month, Ukraine solemnly marked 1 year since Russia's invasion. While the U.S. has provided billions of dollars in security, economic, humanitarian assistance, it undermines that very aid by having leaky anti-money laundering rules that allow Russia to continue to evade sanctions and fund its war effort. Every time a sanctioned Russian oligarch has new assets frozen, a more sinister truth is revealed. The United States obstructs its own economic sanctions policy by failing to simultaneously tackle these leaky rules that draw and allow these oligarchs to invest in rule of law jurisdictions like the U.S. in the first place. One case I'll just flag to demonstrate the scale is the case of Suleiman Karimov, who parked $1 billion in Delaware Trust and then in turn invested those funds in US markets. That $1 billion has since been frozen, but it's just the tip of the oligarchic iceberg and represents the equivalent of 1/4 of US humanitarian aid to Ukraine. So it begs the question, how much more effective could we be in our humanitarian assistance and the use of taxpayer funds if we actually crack down on these gaps in our rules? Core to the success of these crucial anti-money laundering national security reforms is the issue of funding for FinCEN, the Bureau of the Treasury Department responsible for carrying out these reforms and protecting the US financial system. Today, we're anticipating the rollout of President Biden's fiscal year 2024 budget request, which outlines what funding the administration deems necessary to achieve its goals. In the past few years, the president has requested significant increases for FinCEN, recognizing the vitality of that Bureau of the Treasury Department to its national security and foreign policy aims. Last year, Congress provided an additional 18% increase to FinCEN over enacted levels, but this still fell short of the 31% that the administration had requested. And Congress should move more quickly to fully fund FinCEN so it can best protect the US. One final point. Of course, budgetary and political pressures are on the minds of all in the current congressional makeup, but funding a critical national security office should not become political. Congress must move bipartisanly to give FinCEN the financial resources it needs to carry out the ambitious agenda to close the gates to those that continue to weaponize US financial systems against our security and against democracy worldwide. Thanks.
Thank you, Erica. And we'll turn to our final speaker in this initial round. And please get your questions ready and submit them through the Q&A function. I'll turn now to Zoe Ryder, who is the Director of Special Initiatives at the Project on Government Oversight, as well as the co-founder of the Anti-Corruption Data Collective. Zoe, over to you.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks to all of you for coming this morning. I'm really glad to follow Erica, who's laid out very nicely what's at stake here. I'd just like to underscore that for corrupt actors and criminal networks, figuring out where to hide, protect, and grow their assets is an endless game of whack-a-mole, and the US government needs to stop lagging so behind in that game. So as we are anticipating getting to final rulemaking on real estate, it's long overdue to focus on another gaping hole in our anti-money laundering regime, as several have alluded to, which is private investment funds. Private investment funds are a huge financial sector, at least 11 trillion in the US and growing, yet the investment advisors who manage those funds are not required to do the anti-money laundering checks that banks are, which is to know who the beneficial owner of an account is, assess whether there is risk of money laundering, and to report suspicious activity to Treasury. As many know, thanks to a leaked 2020 report, the FBI has, quote, high confidence that threat actors use private investment funds to launder money. This should come as no surprise to journalists here, many of whom have covered stories related to that problem. Now, as Gary mentioned, it took us more than a decade to get the Corporate Transparency Act passed. But the thing is, we don't need to spend a decade trying to get a new law passed to fix this problem. The Treasury has the legal authority to include investment advisors in the US anti-money laundering regime, simply by recognizing them as a financial institution under the Bank Secrecy Act. In 2015, Treasury even took a step in that direction with a draft rule that would have done just that. Yet, since then, no progress. This is despite the Biden administration's 2021 US strategy on countering corruption indicating that this was a priority for the administration. This is despite ample research, investigations, and calls by civil society, many of whom are here today, on the eve of the last Summit for Democracy in December 2021, calling on Biden to address the, quote, glaring problems with money laundering risks in the private investment industry. And this is despite a year ago in March, when 6 Senate committee chairs urged Treasury to revise and reissue the proposed 2015 rule. So now it's the eve of the next Summit for Democracy, and to date, there is no real progress on closing this massive loophole in the US anti-money laundering regime. So I very much hope that the Biden administration understands now with greater urgency how important closing this loophole will be to tackling corruption and protecting democracy around the world. Nothing less than an announcement by Treasury at or before the summit that they are revising and reissuing the investment advisor rule will do to demonstrate that understanding and protect our national security. Thanks. I look forward to questions later.
Thank you very much, Zoe. Reminder that we are now open for questions for our panel of experts. While we wait for questions to come in, I have one of my own, maybe turn to Elise. How have law enforcement and the banking industry reacted to this proposed second rule around access to the beneficial ownership registry?
Well, I think it's surprising that we're on the same side as the banks and law enforcement groups in our disappointment for how access is so restricted for them when it comes to looking at the data in the registry. If you want to see comment letters that address this, there's one by the National District Attorneys Association, another by the National Association of Attorneys General, saying that the restrictions on their ability to access registry data are just too high and not based in law. So we've had, and the banks have also talked about how the registry will be of little or no use to them because they are only allowed to access documents filed by their own customer. And of course, they can get that from the customers themselves. Confirming that they've been filed with the registry doesn't take you very far. What banks should be able to do with the registry is if they have a customer, they have certain beneficial owners, they ought to be able to see if those beneficial owners are also owning or controlling other companies. You could find out, oh, gee, all of these are based in secrecy jurisdictions, for example. That might raise some red flags and encourage the banks to evaluate the risk differently. There's no clear reason for why FinCEN is restricting access in such a draconian way for state and local agencies, law enforcement agencies, and for financial institutions.
Thanks so much, Elise. Another question is for Lakshmi. You talked about money laundering through real estate. And I think if people think about that issue at all, it's properly associated with, say, a kleptocrat buying a Malibu mansion, largely confined to residential real estate. But this is obviously a huge problem in commercial real estate. And why is that so? And what would you expect from the Biden administration to deal with the problem in the commercial real estate sector?
That's a great question, Ian, and you're absolutely right. Everything that's happened so far, all our rules, even the GTOs only cover the purchases of a residential property. Why commercial is significant is because even though the numbers of properties tend to be purchased are fewer in commercial real estate, by value, they are significantly larger. So on average, there's millions more going into commercial real estate than your average residential property. What makes it harder to detect is that commercial real estate deals can often involve multiple players, starting from 4. And as Zoe mentioned, if you're investing through an investment fund structure, the number of people involved in a deal can go up to 100. So even 1% of $100 million deal is still a lot of money. And that's one of the reasons that when we did our research, we found that about 37% of all cases that we found involved a commercial real estate property. Now, even as we talk about the Russia-Ukraine war, we've seen that, oligarchs like Oleg Deripaska and others have invested in aluminum factories, in Kentucky, battery factories, in North Carolina. The Kolomoiskys have devastated the Midwest. So there are a plethora of examples that show that this problem is systemic and deep when we talk about real estate. And yet the conversation to really kickstart and roll the ball in commercial real estate isn't at the place where it should be. And again, we are the only G7 country that hasn't made any impetus to even tackle real estate, but especially commercial real estate. And that should sort of motivate us to do something about this.
Great, thank you. We have a question in from Michael at Bloomberg Tax. He asks, last year, a few states considered bills addressing LLC transparency, including New York and perhaps Alaska, Wyoming. Is this idea getting any traction this year? Which states should we watch? Who would like to respond to that?
I can take a first pass. Excuse me. Michael, thank you for the question. When it comes to New York, there's still a lot of interest and momentum in moving forward the LLC Transparency Act in the new session of the Legislative Assembly. And there's forward movement there. A lot of the interest last year really came out of the pressure from the Pandora Papers that generated scrutiny in these jurisdictions over the reuse of trusts and other secrecy vehicles to obscure illicit funds. That said, is that there's increasing interest from civil society groups, from legislators, and from others in moving forward some of these reforms. I think the biggest motivator and momentum builder toward these reforms is continued interest from journalists like yourself and investigative journalists to make sure that there's increased scrutiny and forward movement on understanding the problem in such a way that can build the momentum for change. But that said, a lot of these in-state efforts go hand in hand with the implementation of the Federal Corporate Transparency Act, and in filling in some of the gaps, so to speak, that the statute itself wasn't able to cover. And so in seeing the Corporate Transparency Act implemented, we're one step closer toward eradicating some of the secrecy in these jurisdictions. And that must be paired with action at the state level as well. Invite other colleagues to chime in.
If I could add one more detail here, this may be too in the weeds, but I'm just going to mention it. The Corporate Transparency Act requires disclosures of beneficial owners from entities that are registered to do business in the United States. So that covers all entities that are formed in secrecy jurisdictions, other countries, tax havens. If they are registered to do business here, they have to disclose their beneficial owners in our registry. However, we have found that there are some states that say when it comes to registering to do business, the phrase transacting business is interpreted as not to include getting a mortgage or owning real estate in a particular state. They exempt them from the registration requirement. That just shows you that the beneficial ownership law is not a panacea. It's not going to cure all these problems, and we need work on the state level as well.
Great, thanks, Elise. We have a question from Nahal Tusi. Question basically is, what do we think the hurdles are towards progress inside the Biden administration? There are obviously a lot of champions inside the Biden administration. Do we think that there are hurdles in terms of resourcing? Are there other political hurdles that we think are getting in the way of progress on corruption? For example, issues related to geopolitical competition or other national security interests that, when pitted against corruption, sometimes trump the efforts to advance our anti-corruption agenda. Is there anybody on the panel who would like to touch on that? Maybe Gary, Zoe.
Happy to jump in, and then Zoe, please follow up with anything I missed. Erica did mention this and touch on the issue of resources, and that can't be understated in this sense. Transparency International last year did a study looking at financial intelligence units. So this is our version is called the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN. That's the main bureau looking at collecting and disseminating anti-money laundering data and information. And we found that, for example, our staffing levels at FinCEN are smaller than those in the equivalent agency in Australia, with an economy 1/15 the size and not the owner of the world reserve currency. So resources is a significant issue. I don't want to understate that. I also think that the question does sort of lead to a second answer, which is there is a lot of rhetoric. I do think there are champions inside the government, but they also need to make sure that leadership is prioritizing this and moving things forward. And that's where I think some of what Elise said is they started great, and there's been some slowing down or distractions or what have you. And as Ian said, as we come up on the Summit for Democracy or the UN Convention Against Corruption conferences this year, this is an opportunity for the Biden administration to get back on track, and we will be doing everything we can to urge them to do that.
Yeah, and I would just follow up and say, a lot of the challenge of implementing good laws has always been related to giving those laws the capacity to implement. So whether it's about human, technical, or financial resources, I think that can't be overlooked, not just for FinCEN, but for the Department of Justice and IRS, all the different players who are trying to support a stronger whole of government focus on anti-corruption. And I will say that we can't really speculate where the where realpolitik trumps the more long-term attention to really creating robust systems both here and supporting robust anti-corruption systems abroad, like lose weight. But you will see, for example, in Latin America, sort of the waning of critical support for just no excuses anti-corruption efforts, and that are sort of getting subjugated to a model of, bringing private investment, thinking private investment will, automatically ensure that there is a good governance come along with that. That I think a lot of the folks who tackle corruption in Latin America are starting to see as very frustrating to the agenda of ensuring that the root causes of instability in that region are fully tackled. And I think, when you think about the role that corruption plays in terms of capturing the state and then, in coalescing with organized crime networks in Latin America, and how those groups need to launder their money here in the US, we don't have an effective response to that. It is still inadequate. We don't have enough support for investigators and prosecutors outside of just a couple of the Department of Justice districts, especially along the border, to investigate and prosecute those crimes. And we consistently try to bring old models of like the golden triangle between the private sector, good government, and civil society, that without enough of the rigorous enforcement and robust follow through. And so I would just say that we need to understand always and forever that until you go after corruption around the world, not just in Russia and Eastern Europe, we're going to have the continuing and exacerbating long-term instability that we're starting to see bubble up around these different countries in the global South.
Hey, as Zoe was talking, Zoe, you said something that I just also want to make a quick point on, which was part of the question. And there are a lot of questions, as Zoe talked about, and as the question implied, about geopolitical concerns trumping corruption and fighting corruption and the enforcement issues. And those are real, and I'm not going to comment on those because I'm not prepared to do that. But what I will say is that the things that we're calling for, I do want to separate out. These are putting rules in place. This is not, once we put the rules in place, we may have fights over how you enforce that and how effectively it's enforced in various jurisdictions around the world, and how that, conflicts with some of the geopolitical interests of the administration. We're just talking about putting the rules in place so that we could at least have those debates and conversations. We don't even have the tools in place to effectively do this in a lot of ways. So everything that was being talked about here shouldn't have geopolitical considerations. We need to get the tools in place, and then we can, hopefully we can push for effective enforcement globally, but at least have the tools so that we can have that conversation.
Yeah,
I'd like to add one more point about asking about the Biden administration, and it's just has to do with this new form that came out that said, when the law says you shall provide the name, address, etc., for each of your beneficial owners, but then we have a form that FinCEN releases for public comment that says you can check unknown. You can just check a box and say unknown. Where did that come from? I would challenge the journalists among us. We don't know. I don't know where that came from. I don't know why. As far as I can tell, it's unprecedented. We've never had a government form like this that says, there's a mandatory law, you got to provide this information, but all of a sudden the form says, but you can also check unknown and not provide it. That is new, it's unprecedented, and it's a terrible idea. Where did it come from? Who did it? Who didn't maybe know about it before it went out? We simply don't know the answers to any of those questions. But that's one of the things that has made us very concerned that the Biden administration is losing the momentum that it had. There are many champions, fantastic champions within the Biden administration that want to strengthen anti-corruption rules. You just got to ask yourself, where did that form come from? And I don't know the answer.
Thanks, Elise. I was going to add that in terms of this question about geopolitics, I think it's very important for the U.S. in terms of its stepped up efforts to forge renewed and strengthened partnerships with different regions of the world to integrate a common objective of dealing with illicit financial flows. And this is not to lay blame on other countries, but to specifically look at our own financial secrecy house and getting that house in order. A good example is the Biden administration scaled up efforts to engage with countries in Africa. We're seeing that, Treasury Secretary Yellen was just in Africa. First Lady Jill Biden was just in Africa. We expect Kamala Harris to be there later this month, and Biden himself this year. There was the US Africa Leaders Summit in December, and the outcome documents from that Leaders Summit had nary a mention about illicit financial flows, which cost Africa $88 billion a year, and the US is a major destination for illicit finance. So rather than solely focus about official development assistance or foreign direct investment, we need to look at our own role in providing safe haven for funds which are draining out of developing countries around the world. There was a clarifying question that came in while we were talking, and it's for Lakshmi. You said that there's been an exemption for real estate that's lasted for 20 years. The questioner didn't understand what exactly the exemption was for. If you could explain that exemption.
Oh, happy to do so. So in the aftermath of 9/11, when the US Patriot Act was passed, the Patriot Act required all financial institutions, including real estate professionals, to have AML/CFT compliance programs. Now, the legislation, the Patriot Act, essentially would have required the entire real estate sector to implement anti-money laundering measures. But FinCEN issued an exemption to that rule, which granted a temporary exemption from implementing AML/CFT compliance programs to real estate professionals. Now that exemption has lasted and continues till present. So it's gone on for 2 decades. And that is the reason why we currently don't have robust AML/CFT programs within the real estate sector. I hope that provides clarification.
Sure. That's great, Lakshmi. A question for Zoe. There have been other anti-corruption and financial transparency measures included in recent defense spending bills beyond the Corporate Transparency Act. Could you give us an update on the status of some of those important provisions?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So there's a couple. So under Pillar 2 of Biden's countering corruption strategy, the second proposed outcome is to address deficiencies in the anti-money laundering regime, to bring transparency to federal contracting. So we know that this is a priority, again, in the countering corruption strategy, to basically ensure that federal contractors aren't really owned by adversaries, corrupt actors, and so forth. So in the same defense spending bill that passed the Corporate Transparency Act, we also passed something that's called Section 885. And Section 885 basically requires prospective federal contractors and grantees to disclose their beneficial ownership on the Federal Awardee Performance and Integrity Information System, FAPIS database. Now, what's exciting about that is it covers all prospective federal contractors. And so nobody would be excluded from that. And there are exclusions in the Corporate Transparency Act, which would inevitably mean that you have private equity backed companies that are bidding on contracts that may be owned by majority owned by the Chinese, and we wouldn't know that. So this would change that. Now, the other exciting thing about Section 885 is it goes on the FAPIS database, which is public. Now, there's one glaring loophole, which is that it requires the contractors to report their beneficial owners to the extent practical. We need to change that. So the Project on Government Oversight, we're advocating and working on the Hill to have that language removed, because much like report your beneficial owner if you know it, if you can, this would just really gut the potential of this legislation, which again, if properly implemented in terms of the spirit of the law, would mean we have our first public beneficial ownership database, only for businesses that are aspiring to be contractors of the federal government. Now, that's one exciting piece of legislation, and it's been recognized in, as I said, in the Biden's countering corruption strategy. The second is in the 2020 NDA, and this is really important and critical for national security concerns. It basically is legislation that passed. It said certain Pentagon contractor, recognizing that certain Pentagon contractors have been using shell companies to defraud the US government and disguise their foreign ownership. It basically requires federal companies with federal contracts valued at more than 5 million to disclose their beneficial owners. Now, again, this was to the Department of Defense. This was passed in the 2020 NDAA, and to date, we have not seen rulemaking by DoD to implement this law, which is called Section 847 of the 2020 NDAA. So that's another aspect that we want to be pushing on, as we see this as also quite urgent for our national security.
Great. I think we're getting toward the end of our briefing. I wanted to give all of the panelists an opportunity to make some final comments, and I would propose this prompting question. This year, as we've discussed, is a hugely important year for the US government on the international stage. We have the Summit for Democracy coming at the end of this month. The US is hosting the Conference of State Parties for the UN Convention Against Corruption in December at the end of the year. We've got the US hosting the Asia Pacific Forum. There are a number of important events. If you're now in December, looking back at this year, what would the Biden administration need to have done for you to say that this was a successful year in the effort to combat corruption? And maybe I'll start with Lakshmi.
Thank you, Ian. When we talk about the Summit on Democracy, I think the US has to recognize and be cognizant of its leadership role in fostering and strengthening democratic structures. If, as we have said, we are the only one amongst our allies that don't have clear-cut and robust rulemakings and allow the US to remain a safe haven for illicit money from the rest of the world, it really renders moot the purpose and the point of having a Summit on Democracy when we are dismantling democratic structures or aiding and abetting that by taking in corrupt and illicit money from the rest of the world. So as if I were to say the rule that I'm responsible for, particularly passionate about is finally actually having a rule for the real estate sector that targets the manifold pathways through which illicit and corrupt money enter the space, but also moving concretely in addressing commercial real estate. I would like to see a clear, robust rule that has cascading requirements that covers the entire country and addresses residential real estate. But I think it's also important that there are clear steps taken to show that there are movements being made to understand the scale and scope of the problem around commercial real estate.
Great. Maybe I'll turn to Erica. You're at the FACT holiday party and you want to cheer a successful year. What does that successful year look like?
Well, thanks, Ian. The successful year looks like one in which the Biden administration has prioritized cleaning up our house, as you've said, when it comes to financial secrecy, in moving forward the real estate rule, as Lakshmi's mentioned, in proposing or at least initiating a rulemaking when it comes to private investment. And in more broadly speaking, taking a look at tackling the question of the enabler industry that has essentially welcomed a lot of dirty money into the US. I also think that in aligning the Biden administration's priorities on anti-corruption with its personnel, we would have a permanent director of the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network in place to make sure that that bureau has clear direction and leadership to be able to move forward these critical rulemakings. And then finally, I'd say that the administration has successfully negotiated with Congress increases to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network's budget that are commensurate with its vital national security purpose and its need to be able to better protect our system through additional personnel, additional licensing, and technology to actually modernize that bureau. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great. Gary, Transparency International likes putting out scorecards, rankings, things like that. If you were to give the Biden administration an A at the end of this year, what would they have to do?
Oh, to get an A. So look, there's been as we've all talked about, there's been a lot of exciting rhetoric around moving an anti-corruption agenda forward. So to get an A, I think I'm going to go with a number of things. So let me just rattle them off quickly. They do need to, which I think everybody would agree with, they need to finalize the rules for the Corporate Transparency Act. They set themselves up with a deadline to have the the law up and running by January of 2024. They need to meet that commitment. That's baseline. That's not even like, that's just a C, like the average. Like, you promise to do that, you got to fulfill your promises. They need to finalize the real estate rule. They need to move forward on the investment advisor rule. I think we need to at least see a draft rule by the end of the year. I would also agree with Erica that they need to fund FinCEN and make sure the agency has the resources it does to do all these things. And then finally, I would say that looking forward, there needs to be some movement with our international partners on information sharing. So looking at expanding the repo task force so that it's not just Russia, but how do we make sure that we're sharing critical information with our allies and trusted neighbors in a more efficient manner.
Okay, Elise, you've got the Biden administration in for its performance evaluation. What do they have to do to meet expectations, and what do they have to do to exceed expectations?
Well, I'm laser focused on the Corporate Transparency Act. That's something I've been working on for a very long time. And I think this administration has champions for it. But if they're going to meet that January 2024 deadline, they got to get going, and they have to fix that form. They have to get rid of the unknown option. They have to broaden access, make it easier for state and local law enforcement to access the registry database. And the database itself has to not only be stood up, but they have to set up automated systems for verifying that information so that it's usable, good information. So if they do the Corporate Transparency Act right, I'd probably give them an A, even though I also support getting a proposed rule for real estate professionals and for investment advisors. Those are also critical issues.
Great. And Zoe, you have the last word.
That's unfair. I can't top these folks. Yeah, A or C, it's bottom line. The Corporate Transparency Act needs to be properly implemented along the lines that, I mean, that is just bottom line. We can't do that, then we're in serious trouble. And honestly, while we focus on a lot of the other rules, and they should be happening, because again, I started this out about like talking about whack-a-mole. We need a whole of government anti-corruption strategy that has a whole of government anti-corruption strategist who's in charge and who we can go to, and we can make feel very bad or very good, depending on how well this gets implemented. I will say, you know, that we have to remember that this is transnational corruption. Financial secrecy is a problem for Americans at home as it is around the world. And the same big money, dark money, and dirty money are all benefiting from financial secrecy mechanisms. We really need to understand that, and we need to leverage and harness the very strong support for going after these problems at home. So I hope that both Biden and both parties will get it together and make sure we get the Corporate Transparency Act properly implemented. But if I don't see a rule on investment advisors, I'm going to be very, very angry.
Thank you so much, Zoe, and thanks to all the journalists who've joined us this morning. We will certainly be available for any follow-up interviews or questions you have for us and the experts in the FACT Coalition. We will be sending further information and reactions related to things happening at the Summit for Democracy. And if we see additional proposed rulemakings, for example, on real estate, we'll be sure to share our reactions. So thank you very much for participating. Panelists, please stay on the line. But for everyone else, we'll be closing this briefing. Thank you so much.